Okay, well, welcome. I'm Tom Foster, and welcome to this tutorial on a subject very dear to my heart, and that is acting. Not really, of course. Acting isn't a subject that's very dear to my heart at all. That is an example of what we call acting. I was pretending that acting is a subject that's very dear to my heart. In fact, it's just another part of the wonderful process that is drawing and illustrating comics. And we're going to be looking at some of the basic principles that dictate that here just now. Now, I'm starting off, as you can see, in DAZ Studio, a program which is something of a godsend for comic book artists. Um, if you're not familiar with it, um, it's typically free to download. Even the pro version tends to be free to download, and comes with all kinds of preloaded models and things. It comes with what I call Genesis models, which I'm working on one of them here. It's a female character, obviously, and it comes with lighting presets and everything, so you can light the figure, and camera presets, so you can shoot it from all different angles. It really is the ne plus ultra of reference tools, 3D reference tools for the artist. Very similar to Poser, obviously. In fact, it's compatible with a lot of Poser's assets. The benefit of DAZ, of course, being that it is free, so you can try out all these things. I think you can basically try out everything that I'm doing in this tutorial for free. I think maybe I use some trousers, which are an asset that I've paid for, but everything else I think was a free asset. I don't end up using any here on this. Anyway, so what am I doing here? Well, obviously, photo reference is a very good way of uh, referencing your looks and expressions and everything for drawing characters. But the one downfall of facial expression was of photo reference rather, while it's very good for faces in particular and hands, is that you do have a certain amount of the mercy of the acting abilities and physical aptitude, I suppose, of your model. And your sort of own kind of resources as a photographer. I mean, in this instance, we're shooting very, very sort of straight up and down poses. But if you want to shoot from a high angle or a low angle or anything that would be difficult to achieve just within the confines of your own home or whatever in a camera, DAZ is an excellent way to achieve that. It also allows you to have a greater control over the more kind of the broader elements of the character poses. Often your character pose will not just be dictated by the emotion that a character is that you're wanting to express with them. You will also find that a lot of what dictates your character's pose is composition. Particularly in comics, composition is extremely important. Every image has to tie in together with those surrounding it, and so a lot of the way that a character will be kind of placed on a page and the arrangement of their placement, I suppose, of their limbs and everything will often be dictated by how by a thumbnail sketch that is designed to create a good overall page composition. Trying to do that with photography can result in either very posed looking shots um, or shots that don't quite get the composition right. Whereas with DAZ you do get a lot more control. Whereas with things like facial expressions, as you'll see as we progress, something like photo reference tends to be a more useful aid. There's only so accurately that a 3D model achieve the facial expression that you're looking for. Typically, the the detail of the musculature and the way that the skin moves in the 3D model isn't quite advanced enough. Um, Now, in terms of software here, I don't know that there's much I can tell you really that won't be immediately apparent if you start playing around with DAZ. I've already moved out of DAZ anyway. It's just a case of your posing tools in DAZ are like, if you watch a couple of DAZ tutorials online and play around with DAZ for about 20 minutes, you'll get the basic idea. You can select portions of the body, move them relative to each other pretty much however you'd like, and like the figure, using very intuitive lighting tools, place the camera similarly, and then just hit render, and that gives you a JPEG or a PNG that you can import into Photoshop and work on, which I'm doing here. On some other tutorials, I have gone into further detail about the specifics of DAZ, but for this it's not really all that necessary, because I'm just using it to create very basic poses here, and I'm not using a lot of extra props or settings or anything that are particularly important. Now, I've got a lot of photo reference here. You'll notice quite a number of pictures that I've put together into one page. Normally, I wouldn't always have all my photo reference as collage together in one image like that. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I thought it would be handy for you to be able to see everything that I'm using as reference in the one place. Now, I'm just doing a very basic kind of gesture sketch of the figure here, based on this DAZ model. Now, your gesture sketches don't always have to be based on a 3D model. Obviously, a lot of people prefer the more kind of fluid approach of working either from imagination or I suppose some people like working from life as well. Rarely in comics do you get the opportunity to work from life on a regular basis, though it would be incredibly time consuming and costly to hire a model to pose for the duration. But in this instance, a 3D model is doing a lot of the work. The purpose of the 3D model is more for proportion than anything else, really, particularly in this instance. It's just a little reference to make sure that all our figural proportions are working, and facial proportions and everything. A lot of these things, if you're a more experienced comic book artist, a lot of these things are sort of second nature to you anyway. You don't necessarily need to have reference all the time for your basic poses and stuff. You might just use reference for fine tuning, but I personally like to use reference as much as possible, just because I have the facility there, and so long as I'm not too strained for time, I might as well use it, because it will help. Reference never tends to hurt the end result image, unless you have a style which is overly reliant on reference because your core skills are not necessarily developed enough. But that's something that the fix that needs to happen there is that you need to work on your core skills, not that you need to use less reference. Reference is, like I say, rarely hurts the process. Now, there's not a huge amount to say about blocking in this initial. Oh well, I've moved on to a second layer now. I did a very, very basic sketch just to get the fundamental proportions of the figure in place on one layer, and this is the way that when I'm drawing digitally, which I don't natively do, this is more for the purpose of things like tuitional videos like these. When I draw in Photoshop like this, I tend to use a sort of 3-layer process. Typically, I'll do very, very basic proportions on on one layer, and a sort of very light grey. Move on to the next layer. Multiply each layer so that I can see the other beneath. Actually, I don't know if you even need to multiply them. I suppose if I'm not filling with white, I'm just using the eraser tool instead. So I'll do a second layer that's a slightly more refined version, a kind of sketch version that has all the basic elements, facial features and everything. And then I go in and I do this third layer, which is essentially the fine detail. No, the finished product here is not something that would go to print in a comic necessarily, because the rendering isn't quite sophisticated enough. Typically, I do all my final rendering, in ink with a brush, um, and but this that's very much polish. This process gives you will give you some understanding of pretty much everything that actually goes into the drawing process, really. Um, so the acting specifically, I've kind of not really touched on that much yet, but we're kind of getting to it now. With regards to capturing expressions and poses and things that communicate certain feelings or motivations on the part of a character, it's it's a process. If you're using reference as I am, and I think when you're trying to convey a very specific emotion, in this case a relatively subtle one, that of kind of panic, trepidation, but so quite contained panic. Your goal when using reference is to take the elements which define the mood, and the expression of the character, and separate them from whatever is idiosyncratic about the face of the particular model that is being used for the photo reference. This applies most specifically to facial expression. I mean, you'll probably want to give them quite generic proportions in the rest of their physicality as well. But in the face in particular, as I've mentioned in another tutorial regarding faces, any specific resemblance to anyone, even if the reader doesn't necessarily know the person, as would be the case in a few of the photos that I've chosen here, they're not of celebrities necessarily. The model, any resemblance to any sort of one real person, will bring the reader out of the story. And also, I mean, generally you want your character to be consistent in their facial features and everything. And if you're having to use different photographs of different people as reference for your expressions and things, then you want to be able to try and divine rather exactly what is as a result of a particular pose, and what is specific to one person's face. The way to do that typically is to give yourself as broad a pool, or as deep a pool. I'm not sure what the consistent metaphor would be, but to give yourself at least two, I would say, reference pieces for each expression. Now, I have got an instance here where I was only able to really find one that was the right expression, the right angle, and I'll go into that when I come to that particular one. But for the rest here, I have tried to get my get at least two reference, not only of different, not slightly different angles or whatever, but different people. That's sort of most important, because that allows you to look for the commonalities in the expression. What happens when somebody is tense? Well, their foreheads, their eyebrows sort of furrow like that. Their mouth becomes, their teeth tend to be sort of clamped shut. The lines on either side of their nose that lead down to the mouth, the nasolabial folds, tend to be pronounced, because the mouth is kind of clenched in that way, and because the nose is wrinkled, and the eyes tend to be, if not necessarily wide, the eyelid won't be sort of drooping or halfway down the eye. The person will be alert in every sense. That's also why I'm sort of picking out, or will go on to pick out, a little bit more of the anatomy of the neck and everything than I would normally, because you want to suggest tension. In fact, actually, I think in all three of these poses I do end up picking out the neck detail, because all of them are while not necessarily tense, all of them do involve some tension of the neck muscles and arteries and everything. But anyway, moving on to the hands, obviously the sort of second most expressive part of the body after the face. I'm very crudely roughing in the hands here, not at all accurately at the moment, really. And that's something I'll go into refine in a bit. But yes, with regards to the photo reference, I already mentioned getting more than one reference for each person, which is kind of important. Also, paying attention, having the anatomy diagram there handy, just gives you that ability to slightly embellish or even just better understand the sort of defining features, which are sort of the foundations of what creates a certain expression. Now, as well as looking for reference, it does help to be to sort of be vigilant in terms of how you pick up on what body language and facial expressions are, what kind of builds them up, what core elements do define them. And something that you just sort of you can observe in everyday life. There are books, books on body language and sort of visual cues that we give each other and everything that I'm sure could be helpful. I mean, full disclosure, I haven't read any of those books, but I have bought one, which I feel credits me with having done the lion's share of the work there. The one that I have bought is called Man Watching. It's by Desmond Morris, the great anthropologist, author of The Naked Ape. And sorry, that's a little reference there for anyone who cares to get it. But yes, it is called Man Watching. It is by Desmond Morris, author of The Naked Ape, and it's a guide to sort of body language, human behaviour, things like that. I didn't necessarily find it. I mean, it does have a fair few nice pictures and everything, but it's, I don't know. It is quite specific, and goes maybe into more kind of anthropological detail that you might necessarily need to go into for these purposes. What I would recommend in terms of sourcing reference is to gear your image searches in Google or wherever you may be searching for images in a very specific way. As I mentioned in the article that accompanies this tutorial, or at least I will have done, provided that my editor doesn't come back telling me to take it out right away. I mentioned that footballers were a great source of photo reference for particularly extreme facial expressions. Now, one of the problems that you will encounter when you are trying to find a photo reference that suits your purposes in terms of acting is that, as I say, you're very much at the mercy of the acting abilities of your subject. And obviously you may wish to use yourself as a subject. Some people do consider themselves to be fine actors, but when in fact they aren't. The list, I could list literally dozens of people. But when you're an artist, this can be something of an impairment, because if you're the only model that is available, how do you get an expression convincingly if you're not particularly good at reproducing human behaviour yourself? And this is not just limited to people who use themselves for photo reference. There is at least one very established book that is entirely comprised of photographs of people doing various facial expressions, and it is for the express purpose of photo reference for the artist, and that's all it is. One book, one big catalogue of facial expressions. Problem is that a hefty percentage of those photographs, the people who are doing the facial expressions, I don't know if they're professional actors or not, but it is very clear that they are, they're having fun. They're pretending to 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 contort their face in a way that expresses an emotion, but it has this very kind of it's all very kind of jolly and for a laugh kind of quality about it. They never look genuinely angry or anguished. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that someone should put people through genuine feelings of despair and pain in order to compile a book of authentic facial expressions. But if you've got the budget or want to do a Kickstarter campaign to get one organised, then only there's only the Human Rights Act to stop you. That being the case for the moment, though, the problem is, well, how do you find photographs, images of people emoting sincerely, not just pretending to be angry or whatever? Well, yeah, obviously you can find photos of actors and things from films. You can recall performances that you've seen in films that deal with specific emotions that you felt were dealt with well. Source a DVD or possibly an online version, and pause it, get your material that way, or find images from the film. Personally, I find that only works best for the subtler expressions. I find real extreme emotions such as rage and involuntary kind of laughter, sudden laughter, are very, very difficult to mimic, even for a professional actor. And given that you're working in the field of comics, or in this instance, this is for the purpose of comics drawing, I suppose, you do want those heightened emotions to be, if not necessarily exaggerated, at least at their most pure and undistilled form. So where do you find that? Well, athletes in general, particularly footballers, are constantly, almost nauseatingly, constantly demonstrating very, very sincere and unfiltered displays of emotion. And photographs of them abound, certainly of male ones. If you type in angry footballer into to Google or whatever, you're sure to find plenty of results, or even just footballer, and the law of averages will do the rest. But photos of female athletes in less complimentary poses. I mean, anger is not seen to be a particularly attractive emotion to be demonstrating, are somewhat harder to find. I found it very difficult when sourcing photo reference for this particular assignment to find photos of female athletes in more aggressive or extreme with more aggressive or extreme facial expressions. I found one Brazilian footballer whose name, annoyingly, I can't remember now, although she is one of those Brazilian footballers who has become known by a single name identifier, which does make her, I suppose, a little bit easier to search for. She is pictured in this photo reference. I can't for the life of me remember her name. I may Google it while doing this tutorial when I run out of other things to say. But she is very expressive. She's got all those qualities that you'll find in the more easy to track down photos of male footballers, wildly expressing their most primal emotions. and she's got relatively good bone structure, so you know the poses, so um, the expressions that she has tend to translate very well to using for reference purposes, because you know there's not too much in her face that is kind of unusual or distinct that will end up feeding into your drawing. Now here, excuse me. I've obviously fleshed in a lot of the face here. Now, the main image that I'm using for this expression, as you may have noticed, is the one on the left of the photo reference thing here. I am also using my DAZ 3D model. You can pose the features of the face on the DAZ model quite often, quite effectively for sort of basic purposes. Um, it certainly helps with lighting and things. The one of the things in DAZ Studio that it took me a while to realize you could actually pose the facial expressions of the DAZ models. You have to go into your parameters tab and select the face and the head, and go into pose controls. And there you'll find all kinds of sliders that will give you control over your facial expressions. They're subdivided, well, not subdivided, but they're categorized not just by you can move individual features of the face. You can furrow the brow, or open the eyes wider, or move the eyes from side to side, all that kind of stuff. Or you can, there's sliders which are for specific emotions. Incidentally, I apologize for this small delay in the process here. I got a particularly inopportune phone call at this point, and I could have edited it out, obviously, but my technical abilities are such that I decided I couldn't be bothered with the extra hassle. So apologies for that small delay there. But luckily, this video is speeded up to a good 6 times its original speed, possibly 6.5. I can't remember. Hopefully you're sort of following along. I'm not using any particularly unusual tools or anything. When I draw digitally, particularly for the purposes of tuition, I don't like to use any particularly complicated presets or anything, because I think it kind of distorts the communication of the process of doing it. I'm just using basically the default brush, the sort of hard-edged default brush, and full opacity here. There's really nothing special about it. The only thing that's sort of even remotely technical that I'm doing is using a few different layers. Now I have exaggerated the pose on at least one of the hands a little bit, because you may find that with posing the hands, which there are also pose controls for the hands in DAZ Studio, you may not get the exact configuration of the fingers you want. It might look a little unnatural. It's something that I tend to sort of augment either with further photo reference, which I didn't do for this, and it does show, unfortunately. I knew that these images were going to be printed relatively small in the finished magazine article, so I wasn't overly concerned with the accuracy of detail in the hands, more of the impression of them. But were I doing a finished image for a comic book, I would prefer to have better reference for the hands, and to have taken a little bit more time over getting the hands a bit more accurate, because through accuracy, or selective accuracy, I suppose, you can be more expressive, because the more accurate your drawing ability is, the more any element that you choose to exaggerate or highlight stands out. If everything about your drawings is kind of exaggerated and cartoonish in a way, then the extremity of characters' emotions and things can be lost, because everything is somehow extreme. So there's no light and dark, as a film director might say. There's no difference in the kind of mood. There's no ups and downs. Here, leaning rather heavily on this photo of Julia Roberts from her iconic scene in Pretty Woman. Now, uh, what's so specifically useful about this particular photo is you'll notice that Julia Roberts laughing in that scene, and even indeed in the still image, there is a sincerity to it which is rarely seen in films. Now, for a while I thought that was maybe down to Julia Roberts' innate abilities as an actor. Um, while I have no wish to impugn her uh, abilities as an actor, it came as no great surprise to find out that the moment was improvised. That for a laugh, Richard Gere just decided, "Oh, I'm going to close this necklace case on her fingers, and that'll be hilarious." Which is why she does, or I suspect is why she does actually essentially turn and face the crew and laugh towards them, because obviously that's more instinctive. She thinks that this isn't going to be used for the film. That would be ridiculous. I'm actually, you know, genuinely emoting here. That would be absolutely surplus to requirements. Let's leave it on the cutting room floor. But it has afforded me the opportunity to use a very genuine photographic example of somebody in the throes of, almost hysterical laughter. Um, the the thing about laughter is it's even more difficult to find photos of people laughing sincerely than it is to find photos of people being genuinely angry. At least with photos of people genuinely angry, you could at least usually find photos of male footballers. With laughter, I mean, what do you look for? You can't. I mean, what would you search? Comedians? It's not their job to laugh. They're the ones making other people laugh. Comedy audiences? Maybe. I didn't think of that until just now. Maybe I'll try that next time. But that's quite a good idea. I'm sure you could do an image search on comedy audiences. Well, anyway. Um, so yeah, do that. But search for photos of people actually laughing, not people pretending to laugh. Again, the more posed your photo references, um, or the more obviously posed and staged your photo references, the more that will bleed across into the finished drawing, unless, of course, you have the innate understanding of facial anatomy and how it contorts in various poses that you can adjust for these things mentally. Um, it's a very difficult thing to build up. Even professional comic book artists do struggle from it from time to time. You can tell where comic book artists have used themselves as photo reference and where their own acting abilities have sadly let themselves down, or let them down. Um, but it's not just using yourself as reference, or even using that specific book that I mentioned, but not by name. Even just doing, you know, image searches for stock photography. A lot of the images are very posed. So it may seem that I'm beating a dead horse here by going on about the importance of finding very genuinely unposed photo reference, but it does make all the difference. And like I say, find a couple so that you can compare and then transpose the elements, the commonalities in those different people doing the same facial expression. Transpose those onto your own character here. As you can see, I've tried to maintain some consistency with the facial characteristics of our female character here. The proportions of the nose and the eyes and the mouth I've made a little bit bigger for the purposes of this, just for obvious reasons to exaggerate the laugh, and also because well, that's one element, of course, where your model could bleed in. Julia Roberts does have an enormous mouth, and and as a result, that may have bled into this. But I was aware of that while I was drawing it. I decided that was something I was going to use, rather than it wasn't merely an accident. The hair, I would have liked to have used a more accurate 3D model, I suppose. Had the hair on there, because getting the shape of the hair right in 3D when changing angles and stuff can be surprisingly difficult. Hair is not something that you tend to think about the shape of very often. Particularly with a ponytail, you think, well, it's just the head plus a bit at the back. But it's not quite. There is a little bit of extra bump in certain areas. It's a little bit wider at the temples. There's, it's a whole thing. Not really worth going into here in an acting tutorial. But yeah, just working on the laughter lines, appropriately enough, little creases around the eye. You'll notice that with laughter in particular, one of the key features that is applied to the face is that the fat that is stored in the face tends to all rise up and concentrate around the eyes. The fat in the cheeks all comes up and bunches around the eyes, even the sort of small amount of fat that's stored in the brow, and even in like the lower eyelids, a little bulge develops. All these things, seem very specific, but they really help sell the expression. That's the thing about facial expressions, is it's often the little details, the niceties, that make all the difference between it being convincing and not. I'm not quite there yet with this one. I think the mouth's maybe still a little bit big, which I've just realised, in fact, and made it a little bit smaller. There's a few facial details which I've maybe slightly overemphasized, but the basic, expression is there. She's laughing. The hands also, of course, that was something that when I posed the 3D model was something that I did more instinctively rather than looking to reference. The hands tend to go towards the sort of safe zones of the body. One tends to veer up towards the face, covering the mouth, I suppose, to protect our dignity. It's not seen as being particularly what's the word, graceful, I suppose, to have your mouth hanging open. And the other hand, often towards the stomach, which is another sort of security thing. People tend to, put their hands on their stomach when they're feeling slightly insecure. Laughter, while laughter, is in some ways quite a relaxing sensation. After it gets past the completely involuntary stage of the initial sort of bwaha, the kind of your brain does recognize, that you're letting go emotionally in public, if indeed that's what you're doing, and so the rest of the body tries to kind of stifle it in some way. Hence the movement of the hands. The body in general, though, does tend to lean backwards, which is more of a comfortable thing. When you're enjoying yourself, you tend to lean back more. You'll notice when I move on to an aggressive expression, the pose adopts the opposite characteristics of everything advances. The head advances, the hands advance. Everything's about threatening gestures and intimidation. But hey, I don't want to use up all my A material about anger while we're still on the laughing pose. So, in order to aid me in the process of talking for an hour, or nearly an hour anyway, I have put the call out to my good friends on Twitter and Facebook. Well, just Facebook actually, I think, for the purposes of this, to see if I could get any questions about this very subject, acting in comics and drawing and making convincing facial expressions and things in comics. Now, I'm just going to see if I can find any of those questions now, since I'm only human, and talking for an hour straight is a strain for even me. Now, let's see. Comments on my post. Any of them? I'm going back a bit. Here we are. Right, okay. Uh, right. Here's one on. Oh, yes. Questions on characters acting convincingly. Here's a question from Cameron Foster, um, who just happens to be my brother. He says, "Do you do a sexy pose in the mirror when drawing female characters?" Now, this is a question specifically aimed at me. Um, I I can't say that I don't do a sexy pose in the mirror when drawing female characters, but it's not necessarily for reference purposes. That's more just sort of for my own enjoyment. Let's see. Have we got any others? Uh, Here's another one from Cameron Foster. Do the writers tell you what movie they've pinched their scenes off, so you can check and see how the actors do it? Well, yes. Luckily, a lot of writers are kind enough to tell you what source material they've used as inspiration in inverted commas for their storylines. Now, I'm not wishing to denigrate the efforts of writers at all. Often, particularly in comics, familiarity breeds affection, and uh, so familiar visuals and things are often most welcome to the reading audience. And luckily, yes, a writer will often tell you, this is kind of what we're going for in terms of visuals, which is handy because I mean it's a kind of visual communication that they wouldn't be able to necessarily get across just with words. Um, let's see. Do we have any others? Here's one from Niall McGalloway. How would you show that some characters are more religious than others? Would they often be shown clutching rosaries? Well, yes, obviously, one of the most useful visual cues you can use when drawing particularly religious characters is to have all the most stereotypical accoutrement of their chosen religion close to hand. So rosaries, dog collars, um, there's a few different types of church and worship that require you to wear a dog collar, but we won't go into that too much in this particular commentary. My brother says, "Can you draw?" Now he refers to an expression here, which can be abbreviated to RBF. The R standing for resting, and the F standing for face. I'll let your um, I'll let your imagination fill in the gap there. And he says, or the male equivalent, and my undoing, resting creepy face. Well, like any facial expression, resting creepy face and resting bee face uh, can be easily achieved so long as you find the right reference. For the latter, for the former rather, a resting creepy face. That's one of the few instances where using myself as a model can actually provide all the information that I need in a visual sense anyway. Now here we're moving on to rage, so I can talk about this at last. You'll notice there's maybe a slightly more frenetic quality in the line work itself. That's something that very much depends on your style. Not that any style is entirely immune to a little bit of interpretation, but particularly when doing these sort of slightly more sketchy Photoshop digital drawings, when wanting to communicate a particular expression, making the lines slightly more jagged and angular can help a great deal. Generally speaking, when I'm shading the figure and the face and that, unless something has very obvious contours which dictate the direction of the lines, I try and keep my lines relatively consistent in terms of direction. That can help sell the expression and also the three-dimensional qualities of the object, because it suggests a relationship between it and the source of light, which in this case is sort of coming from kind of diagonally above to the left of the shot, and so that's the direction our lines are traveling. Or traveling, I suppose, but you know what I mean. So most of the lines are done in that direction. That's one thing that can help sell the immediacy of the expression. That's more about the mood of the image itself rather than the necessarily the mood of the character. Although in this instance, I suppose it's both. When it comes to the face, this is the footballer I referred to. This might be a good opportunity for me to check her name. For just filling in the hands there again, not really necessarily doing them as accurately or as so much detail as I would like, but sacrifices must be made. After all, you wouldn't want this video to be sped up to 8 times its speed, would you? The human brain can only cope with so much. Let's see. Google. Other search engines are available, by the way, because we all love Bing, don't we? Well, I probably shouldn't just put in woman and Brazilian. Footballer. Okay. Well, I can't even spell woman. That tells you what the state of my romantic life is at the moment. Now here we are. Brazilian woman, Marta, that's her name. Single nomenclature, always respected in the world of football. Marta, M-A-R-T-A. You'll find lots of good facial expressions there, of those more difficult to find emotions and things. It really is baffling. I mean, I was just incredibly surprised by how few images I was able to find of female athletes, even in things like UFC, mixed martial arts, things like that. I couldn't find any really good emotive face pictures. It's almost as if we have a society which discourages extreme emotional displays in women. Certainly those that tend towards the projecting strength. But then, of course, that's probably just me being paranoid. That could never happen in a civilized society. Now, I am being very rough with a lot of the line work here, for which I apologise. I mean, it's hardly my signature. Normally, I pride myself in my attention to detail in line work, but with digital drawing, I do find a sort of an odd sense of freedom, just to go in and muddy it up a little bit, because you just have that endless uses of the eraser tool. Now, this composite here is entirely for the benefits of trying to create an interesting image for the article. Obviously, I mean, you could suggest, I suppose, that you could say that the image evokes a woman struggling with conflicting emotions. That would be a nice way to interpret it. Or you could just say that I'm extremely self-conscious about putting images that look incomplete or not fully realised conceptually into any form of publication. So I've felt the need to go in and make this kind of weird composite in order to somehow give myself some kind of artistic gratification. You could say that, but I prefer you didn't, please. Particularly if you're conducting any correspondence to the magazine itself or any associated online forums. Sorry, fora. That's the correct plural of forum, isn't it? You knew that already, though. You didn't need me to tell you. So what's going on? What's happening now? Well, we have our facial expressions. We have our physical expressions to some extent. I'm now just going in and adding some fine details. Now you'll notice that I get a little bit frustrated eventually with the composition of this image being, well, somewhat like myself, quite distinctly left-leaning from the character's point of view. Anyway, it's it has more of a bias to the right at the point of view of the viewer. So I go in and cheat, as well as doing all these little visual cheats on the kind of anatomy to make this all look like kind of one solid form. I decide to go in and add an extra arm. Now, while the addition of the extra arm may not tell you anything more about acting necessarily, there is an important note, I suppose, in terms of composition, which is that you may find yourself. Sorry, it's gone awfully talking heads all of a sudden. You may find that when you're doing a drawing exercise like this, there's an innate imbalance in the composition of the image. The body can lean forward so far, but it can only lean back so far, which means that I have a little bit of empty space on the left-hand side of the image here, and the only way that I could think of to resolve this was to fill it with something. Many different imaginative things came to mind, but in this specific instance I decided to go with a completely unimaginative option, which was to have my character holding a knife, which I thought would tie in with the tension expressed in the central face. This is also giving me a good opportunity to just tighten up a few of these things, because now I know which parts of the image I'm going to be using for the main image. The individual images that will accompany this, and these sort of step-by-step that show these individual emotions, will be considerably smaller, but the primary image, the main image that you be accompanying the article will be a little bit bigger, so I want my finer details in here to be a little bit more nuanced. Still not exactly anatomically perfect, but with enough little detail and sort of corrections made that I don't feel too ashamed to put my name to it. So yes, just working on some of these last little details here to make everything pop. Obviously, there's elements now that I don't have to worry too much about because they're obscured by the other the kind of other characters in this scene. Now, I did mention the anatomical diagrams earlier. It is quite important particularly for communicating facial expressions and things, to have a fairly good understanding of the construction of the face, its muscles and fatty deposits, and the way the skin in it reacts and everything, because those are the sort of visual communicators that convey those emotions to the viewer. And your knowledge of those things will greatly dictate your ability to convey those things successfully. No matter how much photo reference you use, the weaknesses in your knowledge of facial anatomy will always come across, as my weaknesses in hand anatomy are here, if you don't have the requisite tools for the job. Even if you're tracing from a photograph, you would think that tracing from a photograph would make your facial anatomy, pretty spot on. Not so. You may trace the basic outlines of the nose, if it's in three-quarter profile or profile, the eyes, the mouth, and all of that. But there are a million little subtle nuances of the face that you simply wouldn't pick up on if you don't do your study. So homework, that's the order of the day. Facial anatomy is extraordinarily complex in some respects. The actual arrangement of muscles and everything is there's not too many of them. There's quite a few, but not not an amount that can't be memorized to some degree anyway. Um, and obviously, there's only two bones really. I mean, the skull, I suppose. The jaw being one bone, but the top of the skull, I suppose, does have its other bone parts in the head, I guess. But it's essentially only two major pieces of anatomy kind of locking together. But the shape of the skull is a lot more complex than people think. It's not merely a circle with a bit of a square coming out of it. There's a lot of sort of straighter edges and bits of the jawline that are a lot more complicated than they look at first glance. So even if you think you know your facial anatomy perfectly, it's probably a good idea to continue to study it. Continue to study all forms of reference, photo reference, life, the mirror. I suppose that is life reference, really. But even the 3D models will help. I mean, none of these 3D models are 100% anatomically accurate, but when it comes to viewing the body from different angles, they can be an invaluable tool, at least getting an approximation of certainly the basic proportions of the figure. This knife. Do you need to know about the knife? It's an acting tutorial. It's a knife. I've gone for kitchen here. Kitchen knife, because there's a sort of domestic immediacy to that suggests that somehow has a more sinister quality to it, because if it's a kitchen knife, wow, you've got those in your house. That could happen to you. This person could be holding a knife to you. If it were a machete or some kind of more unconventional knife or a military knife or something, then it might seem less plausible that you might suddenly be confronted with one. The kitchen knife, however, reigns supreme as the most unsettling of all knives to be wielded. This effect that I'm doing in the background here, I don't like doing these particularly. These background effects, with just using the regular brush tool, are not always particularly effective. It's just me trying to fill space, so I've got some kind of finished looking image to accompany the article. That's a little belying my lack of professionalism a little, I'm afraid. Let's see. Yeah, I think I end up going for a more boxy quality. I am trying to kind of highlight the gestures anyway of the figures as I go. I feel like this tutorial has been very light on constructive information. I apologise for that. I just hope that my own kind of personal buoyancy throughout has made the experience worthwhile for you. If not, then please, write into the magazine and inform them of how incredibly unhelpful I've been, if you like. I have tried to give the line working here a little bit of a frenetic quality, since all of these emotions are, involve some kind of strain, I guess, on the body. As I was saying about the neck muscles, you see, I've kind of emphasised the what do we call them, arteries in the neck, and the sternocleidomastoid, or whatever they're called, muscles. That little bit more, just to give that sense of emotion. I suppose for anger, actually, quite a good source of photo reference would probably be vocalists for particularly for kind of metal bands and everything. It's not that they're necessarily genuinely angry. It's just that they are, projecting with great force vocally. So it does appear like anger, and obviously all those neck muscles tend to get kind of popped out and everything as well. Yeah. So this finished image is I guess evocative of emotional confusion. Anyway, I think that's us coming to the end. I've gone in to do a few last tweaks here, but just because this is about to run out, I will say goodbye to you. And thank you very much for joining me on this roller coaster ride of a tutorial. I hope it's been of some help. And best of luck. Goodbye.